I'm Mike Govoni, and for the last 15 years, I've been in recovery from addiction and on the deepest quest to find healing, to experience my own unique wholeness beyond the story of what happened to me. By taking an integrative, holistic approach to experience transformation, I bring you the Healing Beyond Recovery podcast, a show dedicated to people in recovery who are looking for deeper healing and transformation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of 2021. I'm happy to say if you're listening right now, it means you've made it through 2020. And boy, was that an interesting and challenging year for many of us. I hope everyone is doing well and looking forward to the new year and all the possibilities that await us. This episode we're about to release here is a timely one with all things considered because Noel and I's conversation is about consciousness and creating awareness to empower you with choice. With so much turmoil everywhere, it's tougher than ever to be present and not be so reactive as many of us deal with this challenging time we are all in. As a nation, we are polarized more than ever, and it's a difficult thing to see things as they are. Spiritual practice can help all of us during this time, whatever practice you engage in or believe in. And as two Buddhist practitioners, we share how meditation and the teachings of Buddhism can support you to be more awake and aware so you can cultivate qualities that lead to more freedom and less of the conditioning that keeps so many of us on the wheel of suffering. I think whatever spiritual practice you engage in, this episode can be beneficial. So Noel and I are open to all paths of discovery of truth. So all are welcomed. And Noel is also a practitioner of yoga, and he is a licensed mental health counselor with a master's degree in counseling from Lesley University and special education from UMass Boston. Noel is the founder of the Boston Center for Contemplative Practice, a welcoming, collaborative space located in Boston, Massachusetts, where other practitioners and professionals can be found that support people in the areas of meditation, yoga, psychotherapy, healing arts, and more. Noel's been practicing meditation for 25 years and is also, as I said, a certified yoga instructor and former teacher of special ed. He serves as a therapist for individual families and groups offering Buddhism-influenced psychotherapy in the greater Boston area. And now for this enlightening conversation, Noel, welcome to the show.
Yeah, man, it's a pleasure. It's a trip, man. A couple Marshall kids, like, who the fuck knew this was the Ark? And here we are.
And it is. And I was thinking, like, I was such a punk back in the day, and I'm like, how does Noel remember me? Does he, because I was such a hurt kid, and I was so, my mouth was so, loose. Let's just say my speech wasn't very mindful, and so it is what it is. But it's just funny how life has given us both what we need to be on the path of awakening, which kind of leads me into my first question with you. Is can you share a little bit about yourself and maybe your story with addiction and how you found the path of Buddhism?
Yeah. Well, I'll try to do sort of quick version here, but as with, I think, just about anybody who experiences that sort of thing, it's always rooted in some other kind of pain or distress. And I'd say I was a pretty anxious kid. Went through some difficult situations, nothing that stands out as like this was a major single traumatic event or anything like that. And I would say I came from a good family too. And so, it's not something like it was a bad environment that I came out of and I had all this distress because of it, but trauma gets passed on through the generations for sure. And I'm grateful for incredible situations that my folks gave me despite situations that they might have been in. It's actually amazing what did come out of that. And at the same time, you still pick up some of the sort of like fear tendencies and things like that. And from other places as you grow up too, this social, community level messages. And so from as young as I can remember, I just remember feeling sort of like anxious and worried about things all the time, and sort of doubting myself and fearing things. And that snowballs in the directions it snowballs as you go through life. And somewhere along the line, I would say college, just so that's a real quick fast forward. It was really the first time I started drinking. I drank a few times in high school. Honestly, I was like horrified of all of it. I smoked a little pot in high school, but like even drinking, it just frightened me, frankly. Made me nervous. And then somewhere I went to a big party school right in the beginning. I wasn't conscious of it, but in doing so, there was a sort of sense of like confidence that all the anxious stories and fear stories were not in the forefront of the mind. So though it comes with all the other things it comes with, there's sort of like this absence of those fears and some like social confidence that I wasn't used to, and sort of a little bit more ease in my mind body than I was used to. And it took a hold, again, fast forward over years. Now it took hold as too strong of holding that place in life, and then it comes with all the other things that it can come with potentially for folks. And I tricked myself for long periods of time around whether or not it was a thing getting in the way of my life, because it was, I was not an everyday, all the time kind of guy. I could drink and not get drunk more often than not, but there was a pattern that happened, over and over again, however long it took to get there. And, I could use, it was clear that the common denominator in life is, anytime something happened that I was acting just out of the ways I try to be in all the other areas of ways in life, or, any kind of regrets or things like that I could look back on, there's a clear common denominator. It was always drinking. And, I hadn't really leaned into other ways of figuring out how to deal with what the core issues are, like what my sense of self was and how I dealt with challenging emotions and challenging events, and how to take care of myself, how to love myself. And though Buddhism had been a strand in my life since high school, started studying. My first introduction, I pinpointed it, I think, finally one day. Do you remember the Tibetan freedom concerts that the Beastie Boys would put together?
I can't say I do. No.
So there were these concerts, these fundraising concerts in Central Park, and now and then, I know at least one of them, they did an album. Like they'd take one song from each participant and made an album. And one of them, I don't know if there are multiple, but on one of them, anyways, there was a woman who sang the Om Mani Padme Hum prayer. It was the first time I'd ever heard it. I didn't understand the words, but it was, while I didn't understand it in a way in terms of translating it word for word, I somehow understood what she was singing about, or just something felt familiar about it. I wouldn't say I fully understood it, but I was just really drawn to it. It's really moving in my heart, both like heartbreaking and, I don't know, loving at the same time. And it just was like, what does this mean? What is she singing about? And tried to figure that out with minimal internet of the time. And anyways, it didn't get me too far. So it wasn't until long after college that I found the first actual teacher, though I was studying all throughout. It just, at the same time, it wasn't taking a hold in terms of actually, practicing in a way that things were shifting, that I could notice in
And
my life.
were you still drinking at this time, or you got okay?
Yeah,
That always
that
always fascinates me, that people find this path while they're still dabbling. So that's intriguing.
Yeah, I would say on the whole, like when I think about sort of a healing process, and I guess it's always ongoing, but it didn't happen for me that it was sort of stop drinking first and then all the healing happened. There's a lot of parallel things going on. I would say, so I'm 7 years sober now, and I would say probably 7 years before that, so like 14 years, all around the same time, I met my first teacher, actual Lama, root teacher. His name's Sering Noda, and he's a chaplain at Beth Israel here in Boston now. But he used to teach out of a place he owned in Mass Ave in Cambridge, a store. Um, and it was meeting him, being in therapy myself. I had just around then switched to go to school to become a therapist, to learn how to be a therapist. I'd been a school teacher for a handful of years before that, special ed teacher. A combination of meeting the Lama, going to psychotherapy, entering a yoga teacher training, sort of renegotiating my relationship with my body through that, meeting my now wife, then girlfriend. All this is all around the
Wow.
same time. So from a relational front, from sort of a, I guess, mind front, from a spiritual front, from a body front, things were all sort of moving all at the same time. And then there's still a number of years before I sorted out the drinking piece, So, and then it certainly pulling the plug on that makes a lot of the rest of the healing a lot
Yeah,
easier.
was there a specific moment or you hear people hit rock bottom? Was there a rock bottom moment for you?
Yeah. Yeah. It was right after my son was born, so it was essentially feeling like shit in the morning for the first time after my son had been born. And it was just like, I can't, this is it. I'm fucking done with this. It was like, it was just, and I had thought I had been done any number of times or said I was going to take a break, but something just majorly shifted. I just couldn't, because I was in a position now at that moment where I didn't feel like I could attend to him the way I wanted to.
Yeah.
It was like so screamingly in the way of my life. There was no unseeing that.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I respect that and relate that. When I got sober in a 12-step fellowship in the beginning, and one of the things I used to hear at the podium was, these people would say, "My children have never seen me drink," and that was so catching, and that caught my attention so much because the alcoholism that I witnessed with my mother was so painful. So anybody that could actually do it, for themselves or their children, whatever got them in the door so their kids wouldn't see them drink was so attractive to me. So I think that's beautiful. And it's like these little beings. I don't have a child yet, but it's like these little beings call in the deepest part of us that want us to like change and morph so we don't continue to pass this trauma on to them. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those things that it just sort of clarifies what's important to you. It just kind of, the snow globe settles and you go, okay, this is what's important. This is what's serving that. This is what's not serving that. Clear scene. And you know what's got to go and what doesn't. And that was that for me. It never went back. But I also don't think I would have been ready for that had it not been for also years of healing prior to that. I wasn't, something in me thought I wasn't ready to pull the plug. Might not have been the truth, but
Yeah, and it's like we get what we need though at the time to awaken. There's a great Tibetan prayer that says, "May you experience enough suffering to awaken your deepest wisdom and compassion." So whether that comes through like your own suffering or it all comes through our own suffering, I guess. But your child was the catalyst for you to kind of renegotiate and look at things differently, like you said, when the snow settled. I imagine you mean by when you were seeing more clearly, and you've used some interesting terms thus far. Just to pull out for the audience here, renegotiating the relationship with your body with yoga. I think that's beautiful. And ultimately, for the listeners, you're listening to this language we're about to speak as we get a little deeper into the path of awakening and healing and embodiment. So I think it's just beautiful how you're painting this thus far, and I'm curious, just because I'm curious about peak states and so forth. I don't know the answer to this question, but I'm just going to ask it. Did you experience a deep spiritual awakening, or a shift in consciousness, or a peak experience through the practice, or has it just been a gradual kind of flow for you to really commit to the depths of Buddhism? And why I ask this is, you know, I was a guy that you couldn't stop me. I was doing triathlons. I was in the gym twice a day until illness sat me down on the cushion, or in the forest, because I was so stimulated I couldn't even be around the normal environments. And that's what got me to this path of awakening, was a peak experience. And I'm always curious about people who haven't had that experience, that follow the path, like as kind of, to use the word, religious as you do. Like, did you have one of those experiences, or it's just been a gradual opening process?
Yeah, I think both of those things. In that, number one, as I understand it, and I've heard a lot of teachers say that actually everybody's had those experiences, and there's even something funny about how we call them peak experiences, because they happen to people all the time, and we don't have like the mental constructs for them, or like we just go right on with it. Or a lot of moments people have in their life where you would describe it the same way you would have maybe a peak experience or a waking moment, but we just kind of cast it aside. We just don't know what the fuck was that, and you kind of move along. So I think we've had these things millions of times. Whether or not we recognize them is another thing. What I'd say is, over time, as things have shifted in terms of the usual way I recognize, I think, or understand myself, or stories I tell, like as healing has happened and you recognize that those things are like shaky at best, not really tight, hard truths, there's a slow sort of like easing out of suffering and into the natural state of our heart and our mind, which is, as far as Buddhism is concerned, everyone's a Buddha. That's at the heart of it. Everyone already is that. So as we come out of these patterns of suffering, there's a slow, over time awakening that happens. Maybe there are peak, these moments that snaps through all that all at once, and you just there's no getting caught in any of the suffering. But also over time, as those patterns unwind, they warm up. And I guess on the other side, in terms of moments, or I'm grateful for teachers who come from lineages of traditions that have been studying this, practicing these things, and working on these things for, cumulative of thousands of years. If you put everybody's practice together, and they pass along stuff that works, and they refine it. So I feel very grateful and fortunate to have teachers who can share ways to help point out the ways we suffer, and the ways to learn how the mind works, and learn what's real and maybe what's not, and ultimately learn who we really are.
And when you say what's real and what's not, people may be like, what is he talking about? So how I relate to that, right, is when I was suffering so deeply with illness, and I began to practice meditation, I began to realize that the story I was telling myself in the future projections about what was going to potentially happen to me were actually the cause of my suffering, versus what was actually here in the moment. So I think that's a great thing you just pointed out, because many of us don't know that we're suffering from false perceptions, a lot of the time based on a fictitious situation in the mind.
Yeah. You're right. And that's sort of what we slowly uncover, or what a lot of these practices are meant to do, is to sort of show us the ways that this sort of happens, and see through the ways that we do this. And so when we start with something like meditation, or say concentration, right, or starting to quiet your mind down in some way, some calming, staying meditation, And you start to see all the thoughts that start happening and recognize how many of them were just like thrown out there on the fly, just like making up futures left and right, or getting drawn up past, or our version of the past that's coming up in the backdrop, even maybe not at the front of the mind thought, but there's this sort of ongoing tale of who I am, and all the good and the bad and all the history that we link together. And we just don't recognize how much we're painting, if you could call it this is still dualistic, but from inside out. We're not seeing things how they are. We're seeing our representations of things, and seeing things through a lens of experience and habit, right? So, we don't come into this world with any ideas locked and loaded about who we are. It's all there. It's all open. We don't even have a sense of being a separate self. And then we slowly develop the idea in a couple of years that I'm something separate from the universe. And this is what's characteristic of me and what's not. And this is what gets me good job, not good job, or love, not love, And we start getting these ideas about who we are, and they start to get solid. And I start to think they're really true, like it's a locked truth, We can get a fundamental idea, I'm a good person or I'm a bad person, We might not say that to ourselves in front of my mind, but have all sorts of thoughts that are a product of that belief.
For sure.
So, and we just habitually keep constructing these things. So I just project that same version of me is going to be here tomorrow, and I don't recognize that this is a habit of my mind, or that future thoughts are a habit of my mind, or self-judgment, negative self-talk. All these things are habits of mine. And
for sure. And I believe we're speaking to a population of people that struggle with this probably more than the average, although this is the dukkha, this is the suffering the Buddha had talked about, because the addicted population have suffered from some of the most extreme traumas to become addicted. Not everyone, but a lot of us, myself included, and we've been told negative things, even from our caregivers and people that were closest to us. And these ideas have stuck with us, and this rumination has continued. And we've done things under the influence, even in our lives, of using that we're not so proud of. So it's flavoring that.
Yeah.
So I want to speak a little bit about maybe going back to what you say, the original goodness. And I think, from a lot of us, and myself, coming from a 12-step background, we're taught to believe that there's something wrong with us. We're not like the normal men where we were selfish, afraid, dishonest, and self-seeking in all our affairs. And I want to kind of let that go and bring people back to just this basic goodness, this original goodness that's present, and just speak about that possibly, and maybe how we can begin to shine just a little bit of light on that possibly.
Yeah. And, I kind of had the same response to that approach, in that I think the original intention is to sort of keep in the front of the mind that there's a problem to be addressed here, but then we over-identify with it, and over-identifying with being problematic, or as some inherent characteristic or something like that, and it just folds too nicely into probably the patterns that we might already had going that got us there in the first place. It's like, here's another reason I'm going to maybe negative self-talk here at worst. So just, we internalize the stories that we pick up on over the years, that we hear, that people tell us. You said, like you were talking earlier, even if you've heard something like that from, say, a caregiver, particularly, something, say, abusive from a caregiver, then these are ideas that get internalized for people. And then we start believing these things about ourselves and don't even realize that we continue to repeat the story and end up in relationships where people kind of repeat those stories too. We're drawn to that. So as all these things just keep reinforcing these patterns, From the perspective of Buddhism, everybody is a Buddha just not realize, we don't recognize it. And a Buddha meaning one who could be fully awake, or someone who's equipped with the heart and mind that can potentially run on all cylinders, fully flourish in all of its positive attributes. But then it gets covered over and clouded over by other stories that are more limiting than that. We think, oh, not good enough because of this, or I'm bad because of that. Just the kids getting mucked up and clouded up, more and more limited versions, and we tamp down that original kind of goodness. And spirituality was not a heavy strain of my life when I was younger. We were introduced to Catholicism, wasn't pushed by my folks, but it was what they'd grown up with, and it was what most of the folks, we grew up with, some form of Christianity for the most part. For me, it was more social than anything, but in the form that I was presented, it seemed more like, it institutionalized the guilt piece and kind of gave you this pitch, like, here's someone to aspire to be like, but you couldn't, it would be arrogant to ever think you could do that, and how dare you, and you should feel bad about all the horrendous shit you've done. Like, doesn't matter if you've done anything, you came into this world like like
bad. The sins, your sins need to be forgiven.
Yeah, and I don't imagine that was the original intent here, but that's the message that often got conveyed to a lot of people, and I think that's what I picked up on. And so that just sort of adds to the negative self-talk. And here's now a spirituality that says, hey, you're Buddha, you just forgot. So, somewhere we forgot. And sometimes we can remember for a moment, and we learn to remember for longer, and learn to, even on days when we don't remember, in the back of our mind go, yeah, it's okay, I don't remember, because I know it's not the truth, but that's what we're experiencing still. It's okay. And you start to identify more and more with what's, behind the clouds there.
Yeah. And what would you say to someone who's listening, who is continuing to just come up with, like, maybe the yeah buts, like, yeah but, like, my life is like this, yeah but I did all these things, yeah but I'm not whole, yeah but, like, because many of us can't see the sunlight behind the clouds. For example, this beautiful consciousness, this conscious awareness, this loving presence that can actually be with experience, that can actually see things more clearly, that can actually see the less of the separation from one another, but more of the inclusivity. It's how do we discover that? What would you say to someone? How do you begin to see that?
Yeah, there are a lot of paths, which is why there are so many different spiritual paths out there, right? I think ultimately this is what, as I understand, a lot of them are about, right? So different paths for different folks. I think some element of that, if we begin to, like, sort of calm our mind down and concentrate our mind down, and it gets a little bit quieter in there, you start to see through the cracks of the thought stories that are happening. That's one path people go. Another path is love and compassion. Whether that's learning to love ourselves, or being in loving relationships, being in loving friendships, loving partnerships, where there's sort of like a new learning space to feel that unconditional love that's underneath everything. I think you can get to this feeling in a moment of feeling perfectly loved or loving someone, just as well as, concentrating your mind and quieting it down and seeing that your thoughts are just something your mind's putting out there, So I think there's a relational approach to this. So if, for example, if you feel, okay, like, I'm not good enough based on ideas I have about myself or things I've done, right? I'm not good enough to be loved, or I'm not good enough for this world. I'm not good enough for this person. And then somebody say loves you, and in loving you is showing you are not like as you are. We might begin to shift in feeling that might be true.
Yeah.
Or if by sitting with myself, giving myself time to say, sit down on a cushion for a little while with no expectations, or, engage in some form of self-care or something like a loving act for oneself, whatever that might be for you. And in that moment, you're deciding like taking care of myself because today was a tough day, or, whatever it might, giving myself what I need is I'm worthy of that.
Yeah. The self-care piece is actually, it's really beautiful, Noel. Like I can identify with that, and really having to nurture myself back to health. And in that act of, making, chicken soup and taking care of myself, I begin to practice this compassion, of actually
Yeah.
like, having those moments of seeing my suffering as it is, and then still meeting it with this chicken soup. So for example, in a different context, like Noel's saying, just, taking care of yourself. Maybe that's waking up today and not, eating a bunch of sugar, or, puffing on nicotines, or drinking or drugging, but choosing something different. And that can be the beginning. And for myself, it, to see this basic goodness we're talking about, it took personally me, sitting down and practicing formal meditation. But I think it's great that you give alternate paths to that, because after all, paths are many, truth is one, therapies are many, healing is one. These are all designed to the same place. And Buddhism, I know, coming from a Christian background, I was always taught to, you're if you don't do this, you're going to hell. Something's wrong with you. But to actually have a teaching in practice that allows you to awaken to your own original goodness, or your own Buddha mind is amazing. And for the listeners for this episode, we're talking about Buddhism here pretty much, although there are other paths as well. But thanks for sharing that self-care can be a beginning part to awakening to that self-compassion or self-love, or that quality of maybe loving kindness for oneself.
To the question of even where to start, naming all those activities that you did or the patterns as self-care, but I think we can even bring that down to the thought level, with one given thought or one given emotional experience, or like something that's happening right now, an emotion comes up. Can we be a loving witness to just that, like relationally, you to you? It doesn't even have to be as drastic as like, okay, I get up and I take myself running, or like I eat well in the morning. Like we can look at this as one thought, one emotion, one experience at a time. Like that's another opportunity to create a loving relational space, you to you, especially if maybe that's not the way the automatic pattern goes. You have your experience and then you have a thought. If that, you know what I mean? If that's a negative self-talk pattern or something judgmental or something like that, we can take this down to one thought at a time. And sort of the absence of those thoughts about not being enough, or say, not being worthy, or not being, there are a lot of sort of common denominators of suffering here, but the absence of those, from, as I understand it, the Buddhist perspective, it leads to the flourishing of these. Without the story of why I don't deserve it, we would automatically recognize the deserving nature of that love.
For
Does that make
sure.
sense?
And I think this is a great area to be, because one thing so many clients of mine suffer with, and when I used to, run a recovery group back in Quincy, Mass, at the recovery center, one of the biggest themes people would bring up for difficulty is struggling with the committee, right? Even in Alcoholics Anonymous or 12
Yeah.
step, right? They talk about the shitty committee in your head. Well, the shitty committee in our heads is not even actually the problem, but how we relate to the shitty committee in our head is more important. And from what Noel's speaking about, this depth of relationality to the emotions or what's arising, between you and what's rising within you is a great starting point. And can we begin to just see the pattern as the pattern and interrupt it with just a moment of wakefulness, of just observing it, just beginning to see it. And that takes that skill. Exactly. For me, it's like I had to interrupt that with some sort of practice because the habitual pattern was so prevalent. There was no space.
Yeah, space. Absolutely. I think you do need that little half a beat to go, oh, look at that. That thought I just had, you need that little bit of space, start shaking it loose. And I think this is why a lot of people start with, sometimes it gets confused for being the whole of it, but people start with mindfulness. It's a great starting point, but also it's the starting point. But it's, the calming and staying of the mind where you're learning to concentrate on something and, softening how far your mind goes and all sorts of patterns. You're kind of sticking on one thing, whether it be breath or something else. You start to get a little bit more familiarity, if not already, like I'm aware of what patterns happen. I see the same kind of stuff happens over and over again when I sit down. Right? It's a little microcosm of the rest of your world. And maybe when you start recognizing it happening, it's a little bit easier to kind of stop it before it goes too far. And then it gets a little bit quieter in there. And the patterns get more and more obvious. And then maybe the bigger picture of the patterns get more obvious. And then there might be enough space to even not just recognize that I'm doing, this same old thing again, but maybe even respond to that differently. Mm-hmm. And then eventually that might become a new habit. So in terms of the committee, I think a couple of things. I think we want to not try to ignore and vilify the whole thing. We actually want to bring some more loving people on board and then learn to relate to the people in the committee, because they all got there trying to love you. All the protective, even fucked up things we all do. The common denominator, everyone wants to be happy. No one wants to suffer. Everyone wants to be loved. And everything we all do, either skillfully or not, is an attempt at that. All these sort of coping strategies we learned over life, or maybe not so helpful strategies, they came up for a reason. They came up protective. They came up to do something. Maybe we don't need them anymore, and maybe it wasn't the best possible strategy, but it was the one we knew at the time. It was the one that happened. So that's like, we will recognize that. I don't want to get stuck on the committee thing, but this popped in my mind. Relationally, when we learn to love ourselves, we don't want to vilify half ourselves, or vilify that committee, because that's just part of me.
Yeah. So like Stephen Porges, I believe in the polyvagal theta, he would say, all parts. Actually, no, excuse me, Dick Schwartz, internal family system. He'd say all parts are welcome. Yeah. So we can't cut these parts off. In fact, the committee and the part that's keeping us safe, or we might call them a manager part, does certain things, for a reason, to keep us safe, to not allow us to experience the shame we did as a kid. Like, all these are still arising for certain reasons. And like you said, when we can give them space, when we can not vilify them, but actually like just slow down and notice them, right? Then we can have an opportunity to relate to them different. I think that's a key factor you mentioned too, is a lot of clients of mine will say, okay, I'm really mindful of this, but now what do I do? So mindfulness isn't enough. It takes the mindfuler awareness to be present, and then, shifting or making a slight change in the moment of how you're relating to oneself or other.
Yeah, that's where this other set of practices from all different directions and spiritual traditions comes in too. First, the awareness helps you recognize. Well, one thing it helps you do is help recognize those patterns, and the concentration helps you have your mind a little bit more serviceable. It goes where you want it to go. But then it's kind of like, okay, great. I know what I do, and this is what I want to put my mind on, but maybe I don't have maps yet for how I'd like it to be. I think this is where different traditions can come in, is we have sort of roadmaps for how it could be otherwise, or examples of that, or people we look up to for that, or like whether it's a teacher or, it doesn't have to be a formal teacher in that sense, but how do we then practice? I recognize what my patterns of suffering are. I'm even aware I'm doing it. I can see I'm doing it now, but now what do I do? Like, how do I practice the alternative road? And that go a lot of different ways with that, but
For sure. And that's one thing. Buddhism has been a wonderful map for me. And if you know anything about the Buddha, he made lots of lists. So he's got lots of lists for you to do, or explore, I should say. And it makes it for an interesting journey, but at least we have something to work with. Now, whether you're on a different path, of spirituality or recovery, whatever case may be, finding a map is beautiful. And my mentor would actually say the map is not the territory, meaning we have the map, right? Okay, what do we do in these situations? How do we respond? How do we act? It's giving us some direction. And yet the territory is when the shit hits the fan. How do we change our behavior and do something different? Now, maybe going back to 12 steps, you may have the sick man's prayer, God save me from being, angry, whatever the case may be. And that's great and all. But I think that where that kind of system lacks, or that those teachings lack, is in order to really cultivate this deep sense of compassion for other, it really has to start with oneself. But anyways, back to the map is just having a map that you can follow, that's giving you some direction to point you in the right way to go.
I think implicit in that too is a map usually means, someone who can point out, this is how to read this, and that map was built, on the backs of many,
For sure.
There's something to be said
and
for all that.
It's tried and tested. At least in Buddhism, there's 2,600 years of experience. And let's shift gears for a little bit here, and let me ask you, how did this Buddhist path influence you, and how did you engage in the present moment? How did engaging in the present moment with compassion help you when it came to your suffering and, what arose from you? How has practicing this path opened you up, specifically with practicing compassion?
Yeah. So I think when you start to either introduce to the idea, start to warm up to the idea that maybe you're not just this separate self, and maybe you're indeed the whole universe, as everybody is, connected to everything. Everything's right here, always. It's a loving, connected universe. We are it, not something like separate floating around in it. Never mind separate floating around in it, but separate and like flawed and imperfect and just sort of like, wretched being floating in the universe. And when you start to see through all the unnecessary suffering you've been through, it can't help but break your heart that you would imagine like anybody would go through that, self included. You see a moment where there's just this like softness of an aha, we go, oh, we don't, it's just an absence of all fear and doubt. And it opens up and it breaks your heart that it was ever experienced as anything else, and that anybody would ever experience anything other than that.
Yeah, that brings me to a specific moment in my mind. I was in Costa Rica and my heart was wide open. And for the listeners, your heart opens and closes like the lotus. And I
Yeah.
never knew that until my suffering cracked my heart open. But I'm in Costa Rica, my heart's opened in this moment. How do I know that? Well, I'm sensing into other people's suffering. I'm relating to them. I'm feeling what's going on within me. And this gentleman he was I think he was mentally handicapped, and he was selling these scratch ticket things on the side of the road in Costa Rica, and he I think he was mentally retarded, and a blind man walked up to him, and they were both and the blind man couldn't see, but the handicapped man was leading the blind man into this restaurant, and my heart like burst open for these two beings that were suffering. Maybe they were suffering, maybe they weren't, but I was so grateful that I had my eyes to see. I had all these things that these men didn't have, and yet they were trying to help each other. And I think that's what you're talking about to some capacity, is getting in touch with that heart and that suffering that you've been through. And for the listeners, if if you're in recovery, you have experienced more suffering than a lot of people. And to begin to turn towards that with a sense of, okay, wow, I have gone through a lot.
Yeah. I think that suffering is very much the vehicle for that. There's touching into that suffering if it feels safe, right? And we feel like we can let the walls down, which is important. And it feels like we can go there and touch on that and feel that vulnerable rawness of the human experience, then you can touch into something universal.
Exactly. Yes. Because we all feel that.
It's like
in some way.
In some way or another, like some kind of just this heartache. And yeah, something that's like a primordial heartache, and then on top of it, everybody's individual life experiences of heartache, But when we can be with that and relate to it, then your heart breaks for everybody, yourself included, in a relative sense. That just, I think, like you said, it can open and close, right? So we try to develop habits that help stay open, not go to the usual ways we defend and guard and protect ourselves. And the motivation to not stay guarded and go back to the old stuff and to spend more time on developing it is to help others to recognize that, like, this, okay, now that we know, even if we still suffer, which I do, not a realized being here, there's not, you still know to recognize it doesn't have to happen like that, or that the patterns don't have to go the old way anymore. It just lights it on fire to help keep you going, and then want to help other folks see one way or the other to facilitate that, for folks to see who they really are.
And imagine we all awoken to this, what this world would be like, yeah.
Possible. It's entirely possible. I mean, maybe we're hitting a crash point here. Who knows? It's like we've tried the route of extreme individualism and greed, and that's all based on fear. People are afraid. People think they have to protect themselves. People feel like there's scarcity, and people fall out of being loving. The natural states of their mind that comes closed because it's guarded, right? It's not open to the natural. What is it? Everybody has the capacity to be perfectly loving. It's a standard issue. But, look at all the things that are inciting fear in our world right now. And people close up, and then we do all sorts of stuff based on fear.
Yeah, and there's a tenderness, as Trungpa Rinpoche would say, is a quote, to quote him. He says, to be a spiritual warrior, one must have a broken heart. Without a broken heart and the sense of tenderness and vulnerability that is in oneself and all others, your warriorship is untrustworthy. It's like, to be a warrior out there, a spiritual warrior, and is to get in touch with that tenderness of your own heart, and know that in the other that vulnerability and tenderness exists too. And if we can begin to, like you said, in safety, or allow ourselves to feel that tickling of the heart, we can respond in a way that is universal, and opens us up beyond the doors of just this one individual, but realizing that we're all in this soup together.
Yeah, that's the natural outcome. Realize that we're all
so
interconnected. Yeah.
And that going back to the beginning of this conversation, is we all have these moments, like some people say, seeing a baby being born, or someone dying, or just a flower in a moment, or the sun setting, or these moments of awakening where nothing else is kind of taking place but just the present moment and the truth of what is. In these moments, we can see clearer, we can connect with others, we can see that we're all spinning around on this blue and green ball together. And like you said, Noel, we can open up to a path that leads to supporting others in some way. And that's been my experience of my own suffering cracking me open, and sitting on a bench and saying, oh, okay, like my days of saving up for a BMW 745 and owning a bunch of homes, and not to say I won't own homes or don't own homes, or it means my main motive in this world is to not be rich with money, but to help other people suffer less. And I know your work as a licensed mental health counselor puts you in front of people who are suffering. And I want to ask you, what's a consistent problem or pain point that people come to you with, and how do you help them? Because the listeners are dealing with this too, to some degree. So what's a consistent problem that people come see you, and how do you help them?
I've used it as an example a bunch of times, I think in the course of the conversation, because it's something that comes up so often, is a sense of not enoughness. That might manifest in anxiety or depression, but feels like I see a lot of folks who are feeling like they're all stretched very thin. This is even before a pandemic, so let's even just take that layer off for a moment. But people stretched very thin, like not in a culture that promotes taking care of oneself, high value on productivity, being assessed as a human based upon that sort of thing. And, a lot of people will come feeling like they're like, why don't I have enough in me to do all this? So what's wrong with me that this doesn't feel right? Or, I'm not finding enjoyment or meaning in this, or as a result I'm feeling anxious or depressed. That seems like there's something that comes up a lot. And then depending on how the pattern plays out, and then how people try to take care and soothe of that, that shows up in all its different forms too. But in terms of what you put down sort of in the DSM terminology, what you see the most is anxiety and depression. If we take that in Buddhist terms as this fundamental ignorance of like, this is what reality really is and who we really are, and when I mistake in that and I try to like grab after things or push it away, or have strong reactions to it, I start kicking up a whole sort of pattern of my way of doing that. It shows up a little different for everybody. Some people a little bit more future worry oriented about the self in the future, and that's anxiety. And then depression is more like current and past events against the backdrop of a negative self-image. It's like these bad things happened and it's because I'm bad kind of thing. Yeah, in terms of, whether even, so someone comes in and says, I'm experiencing anxiety, or I'm experiencing depression, or I'm doing such and such a thing more than I want to, as a way to soothe one of those things because I don't know other ways. People come in with busy minds, busy lives, not a lot of stillness and silence, a lot of negative self-talk, and then the ways that manifests in the body mind.
And what's a starting point? Because people who are listening to this are dealing with exactly just that. What's a starting point or tool or practice you would suggest for very, 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 in simplest terms, for beginners that they can begin to do to help with this a bit?
Yeah. Well, in short, it'd be to start paying loving attention, right? And depending on where you're at, that might mean different things. At first, that might mean you start to notice what your patterns are. And maybe some folks listening already know very well what their patterns are or what their mental patterns are. I think there's often more and more detail and more subtlety that we can notice, even if we notice, okay, these are my behavior patterns. Okay, but what are the thought patterns below that? What are the feeling patterns below that? You can keep going. And let's say you sit down, for example. It doesn't have to be, okay, I'm going to concentrate and get rid of all my thoughts and do this intense meditation, or I'm going to have to come to this outcome, or I'm going to have to shift states completely or something like that. No, nothing intense like that. No big goal. But sitting down for a few moments and just giving loving attention to the moment-to-moment experience that's being had. Right? So whatever's happening, whatever thoughts are coming up, whatever feelings you're having, whatever sensations in the body, whatever sounds are coming up, most of the time we're paying attention to 1,500 other things or thinking about other things other than the right now experience. Or if we are thinking about the right now experience, it might be coming with that negative self-talk. Right? So one way we can start to get a sense of what the patterns of suffering are, and maybe even create that space that you named the space earlier. Or if I already know what those are and I create some space, maybe it's a chance to practice responding to it differently. Would just be taking a few moments, or you don't have to be even just let me stop and sit down. This could be while you're walking or while you're doing something else. But be deliberate about having a few moments where you're just bringing loving attention and awareness to the moment-to-moment experience.
Yeah, so paying attention, slowing down, paying more closer attention, and notice the quality of that attention and meeting what's here with a sense or a flavor of kindness, of compassion, as best you can with whatever arises.
Yeah, I'd encourage people to look at this really in relationship terms. I wish I could remember where I first heard this, but I remember somebody posing the question, if you could take the voice out in your mind and go out on a date with it, how long would you last?
Yeah.
And so this would be like if we were trying to renegotiate that a little bit, right? And just try to, if we look at good, relationship ingredients, first we provide safety and security. There's a feeling of safety here, right? And then there's just basic attention. I pay attention to you. I recognize you're there. You're here. You have my attention. Then beyond that is attunement. Like I know you're here, and I get a sense that you're feeling like this without you telling me, right? And then beyond that attunement, there's also agency. Like I get a sense that you're feeling that way, and I go, get you a cup of tea. You didn't even have to say anything. So you have a sense that your inside world and feelings and experience has power over the world out there. Like there's something behind. It's the opposite of learned helplessness. Like when you have a feeling that has an effect on the world, right? And then beyond that is express delight. Like I want you to not only feel how you're feeling and know that has power, but I want you to be fully express how it is that you're feeling and what you are right now, like unobstructed, minus my agenda of what I need you to be like, right? So these are good relationship agreements, whether it's with a partner, whether it's with one of your kids, whether it's with a friend. Yeah. And I think these are good meditation ingredients. We can turn those things all internal just by the way we are, like whether we're sitting down for a few minutes or we're just sitting and having breakfast or taking a walk or, engaging self-care, whatever it is, short break on work. Like, can we bring those qualities? Can I just attend? How does the body feel right now? How's my heart? What's the mind like? Can I tune to that real deeply? Can I give that a sense of agency? Like, oh, I recognize anxieties here. Give that agency and some power by, okay, give yourself a break or take it easy today or, adjust accordingly kind of thing. Give it some power, not just like, well, put my head down, keep going. And express delight is like, and this is all okay.
Yeah.
Like no second arrow judgment for whatever's coming up. There's nothing wrong,
Yeah.
So it's not like I wouldn't say a deliberate thing you're practicing, but a way, thing you're doing, but a way of being that you can practice.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. When you change the way you be with things, the things you be with change.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you did that, you'd probably want to go on a date with the committee in your head. And over time, believe it or not, we can actually, we actually enjoy our company. Like I enjoy being with myself.
Yeah.
I don't have to run from myself as I did way back in the day. And it, like you said, it's a relationality thing. So that's very beautiful and deep, and it's really sometimes I say to clients like, okay, you're feeling this way, tell me how you would relate to a friend that was feeling like this, and they're like, oh, I would I would put my arms around him, I'd show him some love, I'd be there for him, and it's like, okay, can we practice that with you in this moment? So it's really essential for this transforming of heart and mind. And I realized today that you founded the Boston Center for Contemplative Practice, which is awesome. And can you tell us a little bit about BCCP and maybe where people can learn about you and your work and other practitioners that are at the center?
Sure, yeah. So Boston Center for Contemplative Practice is it's a wellness collaborative and a practice center. So there's a handful of offices here where practitioners, there are psychotherapists, body workers, acupuncture, there are energy workers, people who do different types of one-to-one work. And then we have a large space that's more like a yoga studio, meditation hall. And earlier you mentioned, many paths, one truth. The idea here is we try to be a holding space for as many paths as possible, as long as they've got integrity. There are different strokes for different folks, and people need different things at different times. So we try to provide not just one spiritual path or about one teacher or about one type of learning here. So you can find different types of services and groups, and so meditation groups, support groups, trainings. We're by Zoom, as everybody is these days.
Mm-hmm.
We look forward to turning the corner on that. So we're grateful to say still plugging away and providing support and providing some of those opportunities for folks, hoping that we can keep community going during times when people need it even more. Yeah.
Beautiful. And you have your own practice, and they can find you at the website. What's the website for BCCP?
TheBCCP.com is the website here, and so you can find a profile for me and all the other folks who work here too, and see what kinds of things people do here and what kind of services we provide. That's where I have my psychotherapy practice and do some meditation one-to-one work here as well. And you can check it out on thebccp.com.
Awesome. And Noel, once again, brother, thank you for being on the show with us today. And as I always say to a lot of people, I appreciate your suffering and what it's done for you to transform you, and the work that it's now doing in your practice to support the awakening and healing of others. So thank you so much. And it was really a delight to chat with you today.
Thanks to you too, Mike. I'd say the same thing back to you. It's really awesome. It's a trip to get to connect with you after all these years and see the work you've been doing, and likewise, just turn your suffering into compassion, into love, and love getting to listen to the program and seeing all the folks that I'm hoping you're helping that are listening to it. And I appreciate. It seems like the goal is to really open it up to help show people that there really are a lot of different ways to go about healing and to go about awakening, to go about your path. And, that's important, so people don't feel like their choices are limited or, it's just what they've known so far in their life. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me today.
for sure. Absolutely. And yes, like I said earlier, paths are many, truth is one, therapies are many, healing is one, as Noel, they're all designed to this, to get us to the same place and to experience our own true nature. And, I think what's beautiful about our pain and our suffering is it causes us to wake up. Otherwise, why would we change? So it's beautiful. Yeah. We're doing what we're doing. And until next time, be well. And I hope BCCP finds its way in this middle of the pandemic to keep, supporting people. And if it's on Zoom for now, but hopefully things will open up soon.
Thanks, brother.
All right, be well. I want to thank you for listening to today's episode. It's always nice to connect with another brother on the path and reflect how it's often through life's most toughest and most challenging times that the best of us shine through. If you enjoyed today's episode, I encourage you to subscribe to both the podcast and my email list by clicking the link in the show notes. If you subscribe to my email list today, you will receive my holistic recovery guide on how to discover 8 holistic principles to lose weight, create thriving relationships, and finally feel good in your body, all while staying sober. You'll also receive emails on the latest podcast releases and other valuable information that I'd love to share with you to support you on your path of recovery and healing. Once again, I want to say thank you for tuning in, and remember, you can heal no matter what your story may be. Until next time, be well.